Hello, I've been reading this book, thoroughly enjoying it. It's Gore Vidal's Julian, which is about the Emperor Julian, Julian the Apostate, as he's often called by Christians, one of the Roman emperors who tried to put the empire back to a period of paganism after it had become quite heavily converted towards Christianity, following the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, one of his predecessors. Unfortunately, Julian didn't live very long on the imperial throne. He was murdered, and history went the way it went, and obviously the Roman Empire continued on its path into Christianity, and the worship of the ancient Hellenic gods, which is what Julian wanted to restore, dwindled and dwindled and dwindled until only a handful of people ended up worshipping the ancient gods, and most other people just kind of parked them as museum pieces and things of the distant past. Now, the way Gore Vidal, the American author, wrote this book, it's very witty, very funny, very clever, possibly not a terribly nice man from all accounts, but certainly a very clever man, very insightful man. He's written it as a series of letters and commentaries in which two very elderly philosophers and academics, Priscus and Libanius, exchange letters back and forth, and they are reading an account of the emperor's reign written by the emperor himself, a sort of autobiographical account of his life from childhood through to the end of his reign. And so it sort of flips back and forth between chunks of Julian's own words and then little asides between the two philosophers, either agreeing or disagreeing with Julian himself and his account of history, or with each other. And it's a little bit like the two old men in the Muppet Show, Waldorf and Statler, the ones who sit up in the balcony and constantly complain about the play going on, the sort of Muppets theatrical productions, and also bitch and snipe at each other constantly. And that's part of the humour, is these two querulous old men going at each other. But part of what Gore Vidal is trying to do with this is to highlight the ambiguous nature of history, in that a lot of, shall we say, lay people, I think, as in people who are not professional historians, not academics, often have this idea that history is an objective phenomenon. There is a real history. Stuff happened, it happened in this way, it happened on those dates, in those places. There is an objective reality about it. Whereas academic historians are quite aware, and obviously Gore Vidal himself was very aware, that history is so often a mixture of competing recollections. That this person, who may well have been there at the time an event happened, this person thinks this thing happened, but somebody else who was probably there at the time as well, they don't think it happened that way, they think it happened this way. Police officers often have exactly this experience when they're interviewing eyewitnesses to the same event. There could be 5 eyewitnesses to an event, and you'll end up with 5 different versions of what happened. They've all seen the same thing happen, in theory, but they've all remembered it differently. And so this notion that history is an objective phenomenon is a fantasy. It's a collection of probabilities, of best guesses, of better evidenced or less well evidenced claims about what may or may not happen. It's interpretation. So when the Emperor Julian is writing, oh, this so-and-so thing happened and I did this and I said that, you then get a little bit from either Priscus or Libanius saying, oh, it didn't happen like that, oh, I don't remember that happening, I'm sure he's left this bit out, he's left that bit out, and he should have said this. So it's that kind of notion as to what is important in history, what's worth remembering, what's worth taking account of, and what's trivial or irrelevant. And of course, an element of this is that people are trying to present themselves in the best possible light. So Julian is always putting himself across as the acting for very noble reasons, very high-minded reasons, and he may well have done so. But there's also the possibility, as the various commentators suggest, that maybe he's kind of giving a rather whitewashed version of what he did and why he did it, and leaving out any elements that would be less than flattering to his image, because clearly he himself doesn't know, particularly after he gets to adulthood and he reaches the point where he has become emperor. He doesn't know how short his reign will be, clearly, and so he doesn't know how people after him will think about him. And that's again is an element of this which is picked out by the two old men, is that they have seen what other people, particularly the various bishops and the sort of interested parties within the church, who obviously don't like Julian because he has taken a stand against the might of the church. They've seen him being, his reputation, his kind of legacy to the world, being subjected to a hatchet job by the forces around him, by not only the bishops but by the subsequent emperors that came after him, the ones that are Christian. So you're seeing a kind of almost live, except obviously it's a work of fiction, but it's based upon an understanding of how these things go. And the same is true not only of Julian's lifetime, but you could say my lifetime, things I've lived through, I've seen happening. What I understand about the world will not necessarily be what people in 100, 200, 300 years' time understand about the world. There may be things I know have happened which people in 300 years' time will have no idea happened, because nobody bothered to write it down, or if they did, there's been a concerted effort to expunge what has been written and delete things. And censorship has become a dominant issue, not only in British culture but kind of many other countries around the world, where you've got governments, you've got corporations, particularly social media corporations. Oh, you can't say this, you can't say that, we'll delete any mention of X, Y and Z. There are all these various forces to compete with censoring what people say. Now in Julian's lifetime, and the lifetimes of the two old philosophers who outlive him, very, very few people were literate. And so it was largely the educated, better off elite classes who were recording history as they experienced it. Bits of the world going on that they thought were interesting, they thought were important. People beneath them, socially, the people who were poor and less well educated, not literate at all, they had no opportunity to create a voice and express a voice. They didn't have the ability to write, they couldn't afford the parchment and the inks and all the rest of it. And you can kind of see in modern times, late 20th, 21st century, it begins to shift. Not only have you got a change in focus within understandings of history, and people like Sandra Harding, who's not a historian, sociologist, arguing for a shift in focus. So there's this kind of big movement in the 1960s and afterwards, to say that a lot of academic studies in sociology and anthropology and psychology and various other ologies had been dominated by mostly quite well off, middle class, upper middle class, usually white, almost entirely male groups. And so Sandra Harding was one of the people saying, well, what about women, what about black people, what about Chinese people, Asian people, gay people, this, that, the other, voices who were seldom if ever heard from, at least seldom if ever heard from in America. Clearly if you go to China you hear Chinese voices, if you go to Zimbabwe you hear Zimbabwean voices, but in America it was chiefly rich white men who were writing, studying, researching, publishing books, giving lectures. With the birth of TV and the flourishing of radio, they were kind of the dominant voices on those media as well. So there were people pushing to expand the remit of who could have a recorded voice, whether a recorded voice in terms of spoken form, radio and television and so on, and these days you'd obviously include things like YouTube, but also the written formats, who was being recorded in newspapers, who was being recorded in academic journals, who was being recorded in newspapers, various other forms of media. So there was an expansion in who could record, and that's, so far as I know, I think she's still alive, Sandra Harding, I've not heard otherwise anyway, but she's quite elderly now. But there have been since her retirement, a flourishing of things like YouTube, other formats which, although obviously if you're homeless or something and kind of living in absolute poverty, you won't have access to these sorts of things. But there are people who are living quite low down the economic order who can access various forms of social media and get their voices out there. Now, whether they're being heard by a big audience or whether they're being heard by an audience of 3 people, that's a moot point. I never quite know when I record these kind of silly things, who's listening to them, who's watching them. Is it 10 people, 20 people, 100 people? I've got no idea. So I may be talking to 3 old ladies in a whippet and it goes no further than that. I've no notion. So having a voice is one thing. Having an audience is quite another. And clearly you could, especially if we think celebrity culture, some big Hollywood A-lister says a thing, millions of people listen to it. Whether it's worth listening to is another question. You can going to get Hollywood A-listers who are very clever and insightful, and others who are as thick as a plank. But they'll still have a massive audience simply because they're famous and they have influence and status, and mass media come to listen to what they've got to say about things. So some people have a huge voice, a huge platform. Others, hardly anyone listens to them at all. Maybe what they're saying isn't worth listening to. Maybe it's amazingly insightful and stunning, but only 3 people listen to it. Who can say? So the world is changing, quite phenomenally so, in terms of acquiring a voice, and part of acquiring a voice and having a chance to record that voice in a format, whether it's an audio recording or a written document or a Twitter or whatever it may be, X, whatever it may be, the volume of people, the audience of people who can do that has gargantuanly expanded in the last few decades. It's gone from hardly anyone 100 years ago to practically everyone, almost, these days. Part of that will be a shift, I think, and I'm sure we're seeing it already, in the way we understand history. What constitutes history? What constitutes the history of the world? So back in Julian's lifetime, the history of the world was chiefly the history of the very, very rich and very, very powerful. People wrote accounts of the lives of great generals and emperors and people up there at the top of the social heap. Nobody bothered to write the life story of the guy who mucks out the horses, or the Flossie the milkmaid. Whereas with the shift, particularly in the aftermath of people like Charles Booth, the Salvation Army, was he a general or whatever rank he had in the Salvation Army, who campaigned to help the desperately poor in Victorian England. That led to people, the rich and well educated, if not necessarily famous, but the rich and well educated, starting to take an interest in studying the lives of the poor and recording the lives of the poor. But it was primarily the rich studying the poor, rather than the poor writing about themselves. Whereas these days, of course, let's say with things like social media and so on, you've got poor people commentating upon themselves and their friends and their family. So the history of the poor as recorded by the poor. Now, whether that goes down well with the educated elite, well, it's going to be mixed. You're going to get some people like Charles Booth who are interested in wanting to listen. You'll get other people who say, I don't give a damn about the lives of the poor, now shut up and go away. You'll get a mixed response. Or maybe you get the sort of... I was going to say something very scathing then, but I won't, I'll bite my tongue. The response of certain types of people who want to hear a very particular account of the poor people saying things, expressing views, sharing values that they consider appropriate. So if the poor are prepared to say what the rich want to hear, the rich will listen. If the poor have the audacity to disagree with the rich and think something else, then at best they will be ignored, and at worst they'll be cracked down on like a ton of bricks. saying the wrong thing and thinking the wrong thing and having the disapproved opinions. And that's not just in this country, that's every country on earth. And every opinion somewhere is disapproved of by somebody, so that's going to roll across the board. Part of what also interests me, coming at this from a little bit more of a pagan point of view, is that historically, going back in much earlier periods of time, we are used, and this persisted into the Christian period, so it's not wholly a pagan thing, it's kind of an overlap thing. We're used to the idea early on of pseudo-histories, or at least they're called pseudo-histories now. That is to say, people writing accounts of the world, wars, inventions, discoveries, introduction of laws, royal lineages, chops and changes in politics, all that kind of thing. Writing accounts of the world which they believed to be accurate, or at least when they're writing it they say they believe it to be accurate. You never quite know what they think when they're sitting in the bath after they're finished writing it. But at the time they're sitting and writing it, they claim this is an accurate history of the world. And presumably the people reading it or hearing it read aloud to them, again going back to this issue of mass illiteracy, that very few people could read a thing, but as with priests and vicars and so on reading sermons in church, even if most of the congregation couldn't read the Bible, there was someone to read it to them. Likewise with the Quran, the Upanishads and so forth. You've got a kind of, shall we say, second-hand literacy for those people who cannot read directly but can have a thing read to them. Those people listening to the pseudo-histories, presumably for the most part, believed what they were hearing was historically correct, in the sense that we today, going back to how we in the 21st century understand history, we think of it as, well, most people think of it as being stuff that happened. So if a historian says in 1066 the Battle of Hastings took place, it happened here and this person died and that person died and that person survived and blah blah blah, we tend to take it that that's true. The Battle of Hastings really did happen. It really happened in 1066. It really happened in Hastings, and that person really did die, and that person really did survive, and all the rest of the things we've been told. We assume it's accurately true. Coming back to this issue of pseudo-history, what makes it pseudo is that later generations, delving back into earlier history, come to the conclusion that some of, maybe even most of in certain cases, the claims made by pseudo-historians turn out not to have happened, or at least not to have happened in quite the way they've been presented. So there are writers who maybe got the dates wrong, or they located a particular event as happening in this place when a few hundred years later people think, oh no, it happened over there. Or they get things in the wrong order, or they are perhaps clearly engaging in politicised history, which is to say they're giving a version of history that makes certain individuals, whether that's kings or emperors or queens or chieftains or whoever it may be, seem a lot wiser, kinder, braver, possess various other virtues than probably they did at the time. Why are they doing that? Because there is some benefit to them in recording it. So I've noticed this when reading the early pseudo-histories of Ireland, things like the Leba Gabala Erin, in which someone, a monk usually, is recording the history of a particular nation within Ireland, one of the tribal states, usually the one that the monk themselves is a part of, and they're saying, oh, 300 years ago this happened, 500 years ago that happened, and they're talking about the various kings and queens and what have you, who are ancestors of the kings and queens that were alive at the time the monk was writing. And so if they say very flattering things about the great grandparents of the current monarchy, then they're more likely to receive a pat on the head and a nice financial reward and maybe promotion and whatever else from the current monarchy. Whereas if they say very rude things about the ancestors of the current ruling dynasty, then they may well be found dead in a ditch, or something equally horrible might happen to them because they've said unflattering things. But equally, not only are they boosting up their own side, but they may just as well be denigrating a different side. So if their current royal dynasty is at odds with that royal dynasty 50 miles up the road, then the historian may end up saying very unflattering things about the ancestors of that dynasty up the road, because that again will keep them in good favour with the current living ruling dynasty. So there is that kind of politicised element that comes into histories, in which certain groups are promoted in a very positive way and other groups are denigrated, not so much because of what they definitely did or definitely didn't do 300, 400, 500 years ago, but because of what's going on in the lifetime of the historian recording these events and making claims about the past. And of course you then get characters which are as much legend as they are proven historical fact. Robin Hood, King Arthur, Hereward the Wake, people around whom all sorts of stories circulate and coagulate which may or may not have happened. And some of them to the point where there's so many stories coagulating around them that no one a few hundred years down the line is entirely sure if, not only if the stories actually happened, but if the person in question themselves even actually existed. So the sort of debates around King Arthur, did he exist, did he not exist, etc. Was he, same thing about Robin Hood, was he one person or were there half a dozen bandits living in the woods over a period of 100 odd years, and the stories about those half a dozen bandits all end up kind of lumping together to become stories about one bandit living in the woods. So you end up with these sorts of unclear histories. Now, to the audiences alive at the time these were written, who were either educated enough to read them themselves or could have sat and listened to somebody who was educated reading them aloud, I'm not wholly sure they would have distinguished between objective history and pseudo-history. In fact, I'm fairly sure they wouldn't have distinguished between the two. They would regard often the nature of history as being the creation of identity, the creation of particularly shared group identity, the kind of identities that bond people together. These days people talk about identity in a quite individualistic sort of way. My personal identity is this, that and the other, and it's quite kind of me rather than us. Going back to earlier centuries, there was more of an emphasis on us over we, over I rather. People wanting to know where do we fit in, who do we bond with, where are our links, where are our ancestors. Contentious questions which are obviously causing wars as we speak and leading to bombs flying backwards and forwards, often centre on claims to land based around ancestral claims to land. We live here today because our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents lived here hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so we have an ancestral claim to this. We have an ancestral claim to this place, to these resources, to have maybe a superior claim to other people who are more recent arrivals. Perfectly understandable, because in a world of limited resources, if there's competition and the resources are limited, people can die if they don't get enough resources, especially if you're in a harsh environment, an unforgiving environment with not very much to go around. You want to stake your claim and keep it from somebody else who might muscle in on that claim. So there are good reasons why people get so territorial over resources and want to use histories, or if you prefer pseudo-histories, to reinforce their claims on particular places, particular locales, particular sacred figures. As as to how someone of an ancestor, even if you're not biologically related to them, but they form part of your tribal lineage, some long dead king or prince or queen or abbot or abbess or whoever it may be, who forms part of your wider concept of communal identity, that you can lay claim to them as a very positive figure, and other people may want to rebrand them as a very negative figure. Why are they doing that? Is it because they're engaging in objective history? Probably not. Is it because they're pushing an agenda and it suits their purpose to have that person viewed in a negative light, whereas it suits your purpose to have them viewed in a positive light? Yeah. There's an awful lot of that kind of development of alternate understandings of history and historical figures and modern day people's links to the past, and that's really part and parcel of what Gore Vidal is doing in that book, is exploring the way different groups speak, the way the Christians were thinking, the way the pagans were thinking, the way different national groups were thinking, the Greek speaking world versus the Latin speaking world, versus the so-called barbarians from further north. All of these competing identities and their different understandings of the world and their place in the world, and how that leads them to relate to other people. It forms part of a very vital network, and it's often the case that attempts to eradicate the past are a way of cutting people off from their sense of who they are. And that that's a whole debate in itself, a whole discussion in itself, why that kind of deliberate destruction of history takes place, or shall we say deliberate destruction of story takes place, because whether or not it is an academically accurate understanding, kind of going back to this issue, did it happen in that way, on that date, in that place? The challenging of stories can sometimes be academics going, well, I've discovered evidence that you didn't know about and I think you got the story wrong, possibly promoting their own careers in the process, or saying, well, I've just written a new book about it and if I make a controversy I'll sell more. But it can also be utilised by those with a much wider agenda who want to alter the way the world runs now by altering our understanding of the way it was running 300, 400, 500, 600 years ago. And it's worth being aware of that these aren't just nebulous disputes over stories, like kids arguing over what their favourite fairy tale is. Oh, I like Cinderella. Oh no, I prefer Snow White. Who cares? These become ways of utilising story to either sustain the world the way it has been, or to overturn it and create an alternative world. Now, it could be that the alternative world, it ends up being nicer than the one it replaces, but equally it may be often the case that the alternative world is a bloody sight worse than the one it replaces. And so we need to be conscious of what people are trying to change and what their ultimate goal in changing understandings of the past is steering towards, because otherwise you get swept along and you maybe think to yourself, well, who cares, does it matter, it was all hundreds of years ago, and I'm not bothered if this understanding of a story is replaced by some other understanding of a story. I'd suggest actually it does matter, or at least it can do. It can matter very, very much, because it can lead to massive changes in society that you may not be able to predict or second guess happening if you're not paying attention to why the stories are being changed, why they're being altered, who's doing the altering, what's their agenda, what's their motivation. I'm kind of going off at tangents here, but that's just a few thoughts about the nature and notion of history. And partly this is fueled of might end up teaching a history module in the coming academic year, depending on recruitment numbers. So this my brain has been going over thoughts about history and particularly how views of the world, philosophies, understandings of history and pseudo-history, how they shape and form the world we're in today. And to some extent, I'd say that probably most history is kind of pseudo-history in a sense, in that just as Julian and his argument, well, indirect arguments with the two old men, the two old philosophers, they've all got points worth making about what did or didn't happen. Even if you were there at the time, your memories are a take on what happened, not necessarily 100% accurate reflection on what happened. And so the way we come to understand history and the world and ourselves and our place in it is always incomplete. There's always bits that have been forgotten, bits that were never known in the first place, bits that have been rewritten, chopped, changed, re-edited, repurposed for who knows what agendas, and so what we think of as the world, both very, very distant past but also quite recent past, and our place in it is never a clear-cut picture. Never an absolute 100% picture. Will inevitably contain some falsehoods, mistakes, some absences of things we perhaps would be better to know about, but we don't know about them because no one's recorded them, or if they did, the recordings have been lost. And beliefs about things that did happen that possibly it might turn out one day never actually happened at all, but we think they happened. So that kind of pseudo bit tends to bedevil not only the long distant past but even the more recent past. And it's just something I think we have to live with to some extent, and to be aware that a lot of people are motivated to both fabricate pasts that fit an agenda and also to censor and edit out bits of the past that don't fit with the way they want the world to be. So the stuff that's forgotten, it may not be forgotten in the sense that I can't remember what I had for breakfast 6 days ago, but forgotten in the sense of deliberately repressed. Certain people silenced, certain information destroyed, going back to the days when people used to burn books and all the rest of it, in order to make sure the world is understood this way, not that way. So just thoughts to be aware of if you weren't. I mean, some of you may have been perfectly aware of this already and then some, but maybe there are some people listening to this who aren't aware of such issues or don't think about them. So worth thinking about them anyway.